Welcome all of you to this concluding lecture of this Azaadi series. As all of you know, this was originally conceived of as a panel discussion. Unfortunately, because of health reasons, Professor Ramya Bakchi was unable to join us. So while we will miss him, I think some of his absence can be neutralized by Professor Utsa Patnaik having a slightly longer time to elaborate on her ideas on the subject of development as freedom. And of course, she is one of the most appropriate persons to talk about this particular subject. Professor Utsa Patnaik, of course, does not require too much of an introduction to an audience here, but nevertheless, in one particular way appropriate to the occasion, I would like to introduce her. She is, of course, Professor Emerita at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in this university. She joined the faculty of the center. She was one of the first group of faculty members who began the center way back in 1973, and she served here for 37 years, and she still, of course, continues to contribute to the activity of the center. But if one looks at her scholarly work, I think it would be that she has undertaken a pretty voluminous scholarly work. I think it would be appropriate to describe it as work which has been dedicated to uncovering the structures of exploitation, discrimination, and oppression that characterize the world which we live, to understand the interconnections between them, and also to identify their historical origins. Not only has she been a contributor to uncovering this, she has also played an important role in unmasking ideas about this reality which seek to rationalize these structures of exploitation, discrimination, and oppression, rather than to reveal them. And she has also been, I must say, an unapologetic participant in the struggle for freedom from this exploitation, discrimination, and oppression. And that makes her the most appropriate person to speak on a subject which, in a sense, is about the relationship between capitalism and freedom as it poses itself in a specific way in the case of societies like ours. Capitalism as a system is one whose rationalizing ideology has always, of course, invoked the idea of freedom. It is a system which claims to offer freedom to individuals, to freedom of choice, free markets, so on. Freedom is central to the rationalizing ideology of capitalism. It's, of course, an idea that capitalism offers freedom has always been contested. But the history of capitalism is also of evidence to the fact that the freedom of making profit has been ensured through a process which has always involved very visibly the trampling of freedoms of peoples all across the world. And societies like ours have also been the victims of that particular process. And therefore we confront a historical reality where the freedom of people in countries like ours, in societies like ours, face the barrier of a global structure of capitalism and the inequalities that are embedded in it, as well as the inequalities that are characteristic of our own societies acting in tandem. So what is the question of freedom? What is the transformation that will attain or will enable our people to actually achieve freedom, which is what one might call development, is an important question for societies like ours. So without any further ado, please welcome Professor Utsa Patnaik to speak on development and freedom.
Thank you very much. Surajit, please don't mind if I continue sitting. And this is not going to be a formal lecture because one can't say very much in any case in half an hour, but really an introduction to what I hope will be a lively discussion. So next year we will be celebrating the 70th year of our independence, 70 long years. And the question will inevitably arise in everyone's mind, or I hope it will arise, that in these 70 long years of freedom, how is it that we have not been able to ensure for the majority of our people freedom from hunger and malnourishment, freedom from morbidity, from disease, freedom from lack of adequate housing and healthcare, freedom from lack of education. And these questions are very important. As I was listening to Linadri discussing the earlier lectures, I realized that in some sense, in asking an economist to give the final lecture, we were descending from the sublime to the prosaic, to the very prosaic. But at some time or the other, we have to get back to earth. You see, we have to ask these basic questions. So I want to bring you back to earth. And you know, these are basic needs after all. So why is it that after 70 long years we have not been able to ensure it? These needs for the major part of our population. Surajit made a kind of, little very significant slip when he said this lecture was going to be about development as freedom. No, it's development, no. First you said development as freedom. Now that is the title of Professor Amartya Sen's book. Development as freedom, you see. Now, he asked me at the beginning of the lecture, are you going to lambast Professor Sen, because I've done so in my articles in the past? I said, no, I'm not getting into polemics at all. And I completely agree with Professor Sen when he says in development as freedom, that we cannot think of poverty in terms of income alone. We have to think of it in terms of capabilities, and there he lists all these things that are required for a decent life, for a human being to live a human life. And he includes in that, of course, health and education as part of the development of capabilities. Now, no one can disagree with that. And there is nothing new in what Professor Sen was saying here. It's perfectly correct. Because decades ago, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the revolution in China, the governments of those countries which avowedly wanted to establish socialism, did precisely that. Within a matter of 1 or 2 decades, they undertook a tremendous thrust of development in this sense, to eradicate illiteracy, to ensure adequate healthcare and affordable healthcare, in fact virtually free healthcare, as well as education to its population. And all this was conditional, of course, on the complete abolition of private property. Private property has come back again, of course, in China, and it has started following a very different market-oriented strategy from the 1980s. But the initial achievements of these societies was enormous. And similarly, tiny little Cuba has done the same, ensured universal access to education, to basic needs, and it is considered to have one of the best public medical systems in the world. And it has also sent out its highly trained doctors to help people in underdeveloped countries. So why is it that our record has been so abysmally poor? Why is it that after 70 years, our infant mortality rate is 42 per 1,000 compared to 12 per 1,000 in China? Why do so many women die in childbirth? Why is it that our maternal mortality rate is 200 compared to 35 in China? This is not per 1,000, thankfully. It is per 100,000. And Iran is even better than China. It has lowered its maternal mortality rate to only 13. Why is it that since farmers started to be separately counted in the suicide statistics, more than 3 lakh farmers in this country have committed suicide? Why is it that there is such a widespread agrarian crisis, quite apart from the farmers' suicides? Now, one of the obvious answers, of course, will be, well, you were talking about the Soviet Union, about China, about Cuba. These are countries which had their revolutions, and we did not. We had a wonderful freedom struggle, which for the first time allowed us, in some measure, to transcend the deep divisions of our society into caste and class, and the gender oppression, women came out in droves to join the freedom struggle. But at the end of the day, it was not a revolutionary struggle. It ended in a negotiated transfer of power, and that made all the difference. We had the resources, we still have the resources to overcome the gross deprivation that 80% of our population suffers from. So why do we not get on with the job? Now, I don't have a complete answer to this, so I'll just throw up a couple of things and then wait for the discussion to clarify some of these issues. So it seems to me that the deep class and caste divisions which have characterized our society in this country for centuries have an enormous durability, and they still persist, though their form has been modified. But basically it has meant that the elites who were the surplus appropriators, who assigned a high caste status to themselves, and who assigned to the laboring poor a low caste or outcast status, still remain the elites of modern India. And by their very origins, no matter how progressive they might be, or individual members of that elite might be, they still retain, sometimes even unconsciously or subconsciously, very deep caste and class prejudices. We retain. Let me not sound very, admonishing. I tend to lecture quite a bit, telling people what's wrong with the way they think. So let me now include myself in this group as well. And for this very reason, we have not given the kind of priority and overwhelming importance we should have given to the eradication of poverty and to the ensuring of basic needs for the laboring poor of our population. This should have been done in the very first decade or two after independence. That is when the big thrust could have taken place. Because I remember the atmosphere in the country at that time. It was absolutely electrifying. I was not exactly Midnight's child. I was born in 1945, 2 years before independence. So I grew up as a school child in the 1950s and 60s. And there was a tremendous atmosphere of hope in the country at that time. You felt that we could do anything. And this was the time really to seize the time and to actually carry through comprehensive land reform, to actually try to provide a comprehensive system of education and healthcare, and to raise resources from the well-to-do elite in order to do so. And at that time it would have been possible. But the reason our governing elites did not do so, I believe, is because of this deep-rooted caste and class bias that prevails, which still prevails today. You look at any institution in this country, look at our own university. JNU is much better than other universities, yes, but JNU is still not ideal. The teaching faculty is completely dominated by upper caste people from well-to-do backgrounds by and large. And I have been very surprised sometimes to find people I consider to be very progressive politically express views which are frankly casteist. And they were perhaps doing so subconsciously. They were not even aware that they were expressing casteist views. It took the form of sort of saying that, promoting merit and an implicit assumption that those who came from the class caste background of the laboring poor had some kind of inherent disadvantage which would not allow them to be good teachers, to be good scholars and so on. And that still persists, and it persists in a very big way within this university. So this is one area in which I would ask people to introspect. And this is an area in which we have to make a very conscious effort, those of us who are from this kind of a background. we have to make a conscious effort to declass ourselves and to decaste ourselves as well. The other reason, I think, why we have not been able to achieve the kind of progress we should have in 70 years is the whole question of imperialism, and at an intellectual level, a certain degree of compromise with imperialist theories. I think we tend to underestimate greatly the sheer bloody-mindedness, the sheer cruelty of the imperialists, and also we underestimate their cleverness. We underestimate the fact that at an intellectual level, theories are developed, and they are taught to us as the only possible theories, which actually serve imperialist interests. They served imperialist interests in the past, and they serve neo-imperialist interests today. As an example of the past, let me briefly talk. I've been recently working on, once again after 25 years, on the famine which took place in Bengal in 1943-44. And, you know, this was, I hesitate to call it a famine any longer, and nowadays call it a Holocaust, because it was something, the death of 3 million people, of civilians, 3 million civilians in Bengal in 1943-44, was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate public policy. It was the result of the British government, along with the Indian colonial government, raising 1,600 million pounds in resources to finance the war that the Allies who were stationed in Eastern India were carrying out against Japan. The burden of this was put on the Indian exchequer. Not many people know this, but John Maynard Keynes was one of the two advisors. The other one was Lord Cato, who was accepted the appointment to advise Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer at that time. On all financial matters, he was appointed in 1940, on all financial matters relating to the war. And he was given specific charge of Indian monetary and financial matters. Because of his expertise in the area, he had written a book way back in 1913, Indian Currency and Finance. He had been a member of the Chamberlain Commission, of the Hilton Young Commission, of the Babington Smith Commission, which had successively sat to discuss Indian currency and finance. So he was considered the expert on Indian monetary and financial matters. And he had written in his treatise on money that when you have a war, the only way to finance the tremendously increased expenditure is to make sure that the ordinary mass of the people consume less, because you are never going to get voluntary savings of that magnitude coming forth. So you have to extract savings from people who will not voluntarily save. And he wrote another tract called How to Finance the War in 1940, in which he repeated this. And he pointed out that, raising taxes would not work because there were trade unions, they would oppose it. Lowering wages would not work, trade unions would oppose that also. So the only thing that would work is to raise prices, to follow policies which would raise prices faster than wages, so that the real wages and the real incomes of the ordinary mass of the population declined. And that was precisely the policy which was followed in India. The Allied forces were given carte blanche to spend as much as they liked. It was all put on the Indian revenues. It had to come out of increased taxation. But of course, you could not possibly finance so much out of increased taxation. What you actually had was that the expenditure out of the budget between 1941 December, between Pearl Harbor, when America entered the war and Allied forces started coming into India, between that time and the middle of 1943, 18 months, that expenditure grew by 700%, sevenfold. Sevenfold. It was all spent on building airstrips, building barracks, provisioning the troops, provisioning the airmen, and most of the required provisions were gathered from the hinterland of Calcutta, from what is mainly now Bangladesh. Now, if you think of today, what the size of the budget is, it's around 15% perhaps of GDP, very roughly. At that time, maybe it was 10% of India's GDP. So a sevenfold increase within 18 months meant that 70% of the GDP was being spent on the war. And it was 85% of that was from printing money. Now, this was not an accident. It was a policy which was followed deliberately to make prices rise faster than wages. So rice prices doubled, then they quadrupled within 18 months. The people who were protected through a rationing system survived. Those who were considered essential to the war effort were looked after. They were provided with food. But the laborers in the villages, the fisher folk, the people who herded animals, the artisans, they simply didn't know what had hit them. They first sank into dearth, then into hunger, and finally into death. And those deaths, those 3 million deaths, it's not a small number, 3 million. 6 million people died under fascist oppression in Europe, and 3 million people died in one single province of India alone. And yet, there is no discussion in the international literature about this Holocaust. It was a deliberate policy of raising 1,600 million pounds. That was the extent of forced savings. So the compression of the income and demand, real income and the demand of these people was so rapid, so savage, that they starved to death. Now, there was not a single voice raised against this by any public figure or any political party in our country. There was not a single demand for reparations for the wanton loss of 3 million lives. Why not? Because the mechanism was simply not understood, and even those who understood it did not speak about it. They were about to negotiate a transfer of power. India was about to become independent. The people who died belonged to the poorest of the poor, to the lowest castes, to the laborers, and the majority of them were, of course, Muslim. So even the cleverest of Bengali Bhadralok who understood what had happened, or the cleverest of the people who were then in the Reserve Bank of India and later served as executive directors of the International Monetary Fund, like Chintaman Deshmukh or J.V. Joshi, I think they knew what had happened, but they kept quiet. So this is an example I'm giving to show how the imperialist power could so easily get away with economic genocide, because that is what it was. Any revolutionary government would have taken Britain to an international court on criminal charges, saying that, yes, India had agreed to help in financing the war, but that did not mean that you had to follow policies which led to 3 million people dying. And the paradox was that if Japan had invaded Bengal, invaded India, then probably the loss of life would have been less, and we would have had an indigenous anti-fascist struggle to throw out the Japanese, which would have been good for us. And to this day, I would say that so completely dominated is our intelligentsia, particularly the economists, that there has not been a single correct analysis of what lay behind the so-called Bengal famine, which is completely an engineered event. And Keynes is recorded as saying that I'm sick and tired of India. I don't want to think about her anymore. We should get out on any terms at all now. Now, that may be just the peevishness of a sick man because he died pretty soon afterwards in 1946, but I like to think that there was an element of a feeling of guilt involved there as well. Now, once I have studied this, I find it easier to understand why, in the present era, at present, and especially over the last 25 years when we've been following neoliberal policies, somehow there doesn't seem to be a real understanding of what the neoliberal policies are. They are neo-imperialist policies. And this lack of understanding also has to do, I think, with what I was talking about earlier, about the tendency of our intellectuals, because they are the inheritors of a legacy, which is not a revolutionary legacy in thought, which is a legacy of, yes, struggle, but struggle plus collaboration, struggle plus compromise. We are the inheritors of that legacy. So we have never dared to raise our voice against the policies and the theories which now at this very moment are worsening the situation of the majority of our population. Now you will say, but surely there has been a lot of advance since we gained independence in 47, everything has not been bad. Certainly, if you look at a number of the indicators like expectancy of life at birth, if you look at the infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, all those have been falling. The literacy rate has been rising. But far too slowly, far too slowly. It should have been about 10 times faster. Far too slowly because once again in our development strategy, our elites have not prioritized improving the condition of living of the masses. One of the important elements of neo-imperialism, and this is what is important for us because we work in the intellectual sphere, is precisely that it operates in fairly sophisticated ways through propagating incorrect theories, fallacious theories, which are not obviously incorrect or fallacious to the people who are taught these theories. So, but they are wrong theories. And the actual outcome of implementing policies which are based on these theories is essentially to serve neo-imperialist interests. So what are these interests, which persist even when we are politically independent? What possible interests could advanced countries have in putting forward theories? And I have in mind very well-known theories like Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which says that, and which has been quoted in international trade negotiations even to this day, which says that specialization according to comparative advantage and exchange of products between nations will improve the position of all nations. The problem is Ricardo based his theory on an assumption which was materially incorrect. He assumed that all countries produce all goods. He used a model, a two-country, two-good model, in which assumed that both countries could produce both goods. And the whole point of imperialist control over tropical colonies like ours in the past was that today's advanced countries could not produce a huge range of products, and they still cannot produce them. These are primary products which no amount of technological progress in these countries will allow them to produce because their lands are frozen in winter. They cannot grow tropical crops. This was the actual motive, or one of the most important motives, acquiring our resources, which drove colonial subjugations in the past, which drove imperialist annexations in the past, and which is completely swept aside by fallacious theories like that of Ricardo, which makes the wrong assumption that all countries can produce all goods. And these are theories we teach in our classes in this university uncritically. So, we have to decolonize our minds. Our legacy is one of political freedom combined with a retention of colonized minds. That is how I would characterize it. And this is not the only theory. You see, what led to imperialist control in the past of our countries, those particular objective circumstances have not changed. They continue, they persist to this day. There is no way that Americans are going to, or Germans or Britons are going to grow adequate amounts of coffee. I mean, Britons and Germans can't grow any coffee at all. Americans can grow a little bit, but they don't, because they have some tropical land. There's a huge range of commodities for which they want access to our land. And they want it today, they want it now. And they have succeeded in getting it. And they have succeeded in getting this access by promoting, again, fallacious theories which say that internally the governments must follow fiscal policies which are deflationary. That is exactly what the colonial government did in India. It taxed the people and did not spend those taxes within the country entirely. It used taxes to buy up export goods, take it out, which had a very strongly deflationary impact, income deflating impact. That is, it reduced incomes in the hands of the ordinary mass of the people, so they were squeezed in order to reduce their own consumption. Their food grains consumption went down so that they would produce more export crops for the benefit of the advanced country. That is what is happening again today. We have had a huge shift of area away from food grains from our own population to export crops. And our economists celebrate this. They simply don't seem to understand, because of the way they have sort of, accepted these wrong theories, that they are serving a neo-imperialist interest by teaching these theories and by advocating the policies which are based on these theories. The most important adverse effect we have seen in the last 25 years is something I have talked about repeatedly, and I will say that, repeat it again. Our per capita absorption or consumption of food grains has fallen. It rose between 1950 and 1990. Since the neoliberal reform started, which opened up our country to free trade, and since these contractionary fiscal policies started, which had an income deflating effect on the mass of the population, we are again back in the colonial syndrome of falling per capita food grain absorption. Actually, our ranking today in the world is right at the bottom. The figure is from the latest data from the FAO-STAT, Food and Agriculture Organization database, is India consumes for all purposes, that is not just directly as food, chapatis and so on, but also feed for animals, also for processing, also for industrial use, put everything together, seed, waste, everything. We absorb 176 kilograms annually compared to 1,032 in the United States. We absorb 176 kilograms compared to 225 in sub-Saharan Africa. We are below, very considerably below the level of sub-Saharan Africa. But does the government care? Does our educated elite care? I don't think so. I have not seen anybody. I must have written about 30 articles on this. I have not seen anybody give a single reference to it. So this is a reflection again of the sort of callousness which informs the most well-intentioned, the most progressive of our intellectuals, that they simply don't seem to take seriously even very hard data, very objective studies, which show that the condition of our population in nutritional terms is getting worse. So when we celebrate 70 years of independence next year, I will have a lot of questions to ask, and I will once again write about these things. But for the time being, let me stop here, because I think I've already taken about half an hour, which was the limit that was given to me, and say that No doubt it is wonderful what we have been doing here, what Freedom Square has witnessed, but it is not enough. It is far from enough. And the message I would like to leave you with is that we may think ourselves to be progressive, but actually we are far from being progressive enough. Our minds are contaminated with theories which are wrong, which we take unthinkingly from the northern universities, and our minds are contaminated with implicit caste prejudices that we are not even aware of, which is what lies at the basis of our callousness. Thank you very much.